The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Margaret Lawson organized the final stack of legal documents on her desk. At 42, she had perfected the art of invisibility within the prestigious law firm of Hartwell and Associates. Her modest cardigan and sensible flats marked her as support staff, nothing more than furniture to the attorneys who swept past her desk in their expensive suits. I'm curious where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in a small town or a big city, we all know someone who's been underestimated because of their job title. Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you're calling home. The elevator chimed, and Margaret's husband David emerged, his Italian leather briefcase swinging confidently at his side. His tailored navy suit cost more than most people made in a month, a fact he never let anyone forget. David owned 3 successful restaurants downtown, and he wore his wealth like armor against the world. "You're still here," he said, glancing at his Rolex with theatrical impatience. "I told the guys I'd pick up my secretary wife and we'd grab drinks. They think it's cute that you play office." Margaret's fingers tightened around her pen, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm finishing the Morrison contract review. They needed the amendments by tomorrow morning." David laughed, the sound echoing off the empty office walls. "Amendments? You mean you corrected the spelling mistakes? Come on, Maggie. Leave the real work to the lawyers." She gathered her papers with practiced efficiency, sliding complex legal briefs into folders with the same care a surgeon might organize medical instruments. David didn't notice the way she cross-referenced statute numbers or how she'd highlighted inconsistencies that the junior associates had missed. To him, she was just typing letters and answering phones. The drive home through their affluent neighborhood showcased David's success at every turn. The house he'd bought dominated the corner lot, all glass and steel angles that spoke of money and ambition. Inside, Margaret moved through her evening routine, while David changed into casual clothes that cost more than her monthly salary. His business partners arrived at 8, their voices filling the marble foyer with talk of expansion plans and profit margins. Margaret served wine and artisanal cheese, playing the gracious hostess while the men discussed their empires. "So, David, how's married life treating you?" asked Robert Chun, David's closest business associate. "Must be nice having someone to handle all the domestic stuff while you focus on the important things." David's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Margaret keeps busy with her little secretary job. She types up legal documents all day. It's adorable, really. She thinks she understands what the lawyers are doing." The men chuckled appreciatively, and Margaret's cheeks burned as she refilled their glasses. She'd heard variations of this conversation countless times, each repetition wearing away another piece of her dignity like water against stone. "You're lucky she's not trying to give you business advice," added Marcus Webb, gesturing with his wine glass. "My ex-wife used to think she understood finance just because she balanced the checkbook. Women see numbers and think they're accountants." Margaret excused herself and retreated to the home office, where stacks of financial documents waited for her attention. She opened her laptop and began working through spreadsheets that would make most CPAs sweat. Tax codes, depreciation schedules, and complex investment structures filled her screen as she navigated through David's business finances with the precision of a master craftsman. The numbers told a story that David's dinner guests would never see. Revenue streams, cost analyses, and profit projections flowed under her fingers as she identified inefficiencies and calculated potential savings. She'd been doing this for years, quietly optimizing every aspect of David's business operations while he took credit for the success. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Still playing secretary while he plays king of the castle." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Her sister didn't understand the complex game she was playing, the careful balance she maintained. David saw what he wanted to see, a devoted wife content with her simple job and simple life. He never looked deeper, never questioned how a mere secretary could organize such sophisticated financial records. The irony wasn't lost on her. Every month, she prepared detailed reports that guided David's business decisions, analyzed market trends that shaped his investments, and identified opportunities that generated thousands in additional revenue. Yet he dismissed her as someone who just typed letters and made coffee. From the living room, she could hear David holding court, regaling his friends with stories of his business acumen and natural instincts for success. He never mentioned the late nights Margaret spent reviewing contracts, the weekends she devoted to researching new investment opportunities, or the countless hours she'd invested in understanding every nuance of his business empire. She closed her laptop and returned to the kitchen, where dirty glasses and empty bottles marked the end of another evening of casual humiliation. David's friends had departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne and even more expensive wine. "Great dinner, babe," David said, loosening his tie. The guys were impressed with the presentation. "You've got that hostess thing down to a science." Margaret nodded and began loading the dishwasher, her movements automatic and efficient. Tomorrow would bring another day at the law firm, another opportunity for David to introduce her as his secretary wife, another chance to smile and nod while he diminished her worth in front of strangers. But as she wiped down the granite countertops, Margaret's reflection caught her eye in the window. Behind the tired expression and modest clothing, something harder glinted in her eyes, something patient and calculating that David had never bothered to notice. The game was far from over. 3 weeks later, the charity gala at the Riverside Country Club provided David with his grandest stage yet. The annual fundraiser drew the city's elite, their jewels glittering under crystal chandeliers as they discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes with practiced ease. Margaret wore a simple black dress that David had chosen, nothing too flashy for a secretary's wife. The evening progressed with predictable luxury. Margaret smiled politely as David introduced her to potential investors, each introduction a carefully crafted diminishment. "This is my wife, Margaret. She works as a secretary at a law firm downtown. Keeps her busy with typing and filing." Dr. Patricia Vance, the city's most prominent cardiac surgeon, raised an eyebrow. "How interesting. Legal work can be quite complex. What type of documents do you handle?" Before Margaret could respond, David's laugh cut through the conversation like a blade. "Oh, she just types up letters mostly. Nothing too complicated. The lawyers handle all the real legal work. Margaret just makes sure the spelling is correct." Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Actually, I work extensively with contract analysis, regulatory compliance documentation, and complex litigation support materials. The preparation requires understanding statutory frameworks and procedural requirements." David's smile never wavered, but his eyes flashed with irritation. "See what I mean? She hears the lawyers talking and picks up the fancy words. It's adorable how she thinks she understands what's really happening." Dr. Vance studied Margaret with new interest, but the moment passed as David smoothly redirected the conversation to his restaurant expansion plans. Margaret stood silently, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, watching her husband perform for his audience. Later that evening, as they drove home through empty streets, David's mood had shifted from triumphant to hostile. The silence stretched between them like a chasm until he finally spoke. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, his voice cold with controlled anger. "All that legal jargon nonsense. Dr. Vance probably thinks you're putting on airs above your station." Margaret stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. "I was simply explaining what I actually do at work. What you do is type letters and answer phones. Don't start believing your own publicity, Maggie. It's not a good look." The conversation died there, but the tension followed them into their bedroom, settling over their marriage like a heavy blanket. David disappeared into his home office, making phone calls that stretched late into the night. Margaret recognized the voice on the other end, sultry and young. Vanessa from the hostess staff at his flagship restaurant. The truth about David's affair had been obvious for months. The late meetings, unexplained absences, and credit card charges at jewelry stores he'd never visited with Margaret painted a clear picture. She'd said nothing, maintaining the facade of oblivious wife while carefully documenting every transgression. 2 days later, David's announcement came with breakfast. Margaret was reviewing quarterly tax documentation at the kitchen island when he entered wearing his most expensive suit, the one reserved for important business meetings. "I want a divorce," he said without preamble, pouring coffee into his monogrammed mug. "I've already consulted with Richard Morrison about handling the paperwork." Margaret's pen stopped moving across the tax forms. She looked up at her husband of 15 years, noting the way he avoided her eyes, the defensive set of his shoulders. "I see. And you've thought this through completely?" David's confidence returned with her calm response. "Oh, absolutely. Richard says it should be straightforward since you don't really have any significant assets or income to speak of. You'll get some minimal spousal support, of course, but nothing major. A secretary's salary doesn't really establish much of a lifestyle claim. He gestured dismissively at the papers spread across the granite surface. All this financial stuff you're always fussing with is really just my business anyway. You've never actually contributed anything substantial to our wealth. Richard says the court will recognize that. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Of course. When do you plan to file the papers? Next week. Richard's drawing everything up now. He says with your limited education and work experience, you won't have much negotiating power. The restaurants, the investment portfolio, the house, it's all tied to my business acumen and professional success. That afternoon, David met with Richard Morrison at the prestigious downtown law firm where Margaret worked as a secretary. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched through the conference room windows, seeing her husband and his lawyer strategizing her financial destruction in the same building where she spent her days. Richard Morrison was everything David aspired to be. Harvard Law, corner office, handmade suits that cost more than most cars. His reputation for ruthless divorce proceedings had made him the attorney of choice for wealthy men seeking to minimize their losses. David, your case is refreshingly straightforward, Richard assured him, spreading documents across the polished conference table. Your wife has been entirely dependent on your income. No significant education beyond high school, no professional credentials, no independent assets. The court will see this as a clear case of a breadwinner supporting a dependent spouse. David leaned back in the leather chair, satisfaction evident in his posture. That's exactly what I told her. Margaret's never understood money or business. She thinks because she types up legal documents that she somehow understands finance. It's almost endearing. The settlement discussions proceeded with clinical precision. David would retain the restaurants, the investment accounts, and the house. Margaret would receive modest spousal support for 3 years, barely enough to rent a small apartment in a decent neighborhood. She'll probably have to find a better-paying job eventually, Richard noted, making calculations on his legal pad. Secretary work won't sustain the lifestyle adjustment. That's her problem to solve, David replied. I can't be responsible for her lack of ambition forever. Meanwhile, Margaret had begun making phone calls of her own. Her conversations were brief and coded, arranging meetings with professionals whose names would have surprised David greatly. She spoke in financial terminology that flowed like a native language, discussing strategies and options with the fluency of someone thoroughly versed in complex legal and accounting principles. Her first meeting took place at a discreet coffee shop downtown. The man across from her reviewed documents with growing amazement, occasionally glancing up at Margaret with new respect. This is extraordinary work, he said quietly. The tax optimization alone saved hundreds of thousands over the past 5 years. Who prepared these analyses? Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. I did. Her phone rang constantly now, but she answered each call with careful privacy, stepping into empty conference rooms or taking walks during lunch breaks. David noticed the increased activity, but dismissed it as typical female dramatics about the divorce. She's probably calling her sister to cry about how unfair everything is, he told Richard during their second meeting. Women always need emotional support when reality hits them. Neither man considered that Margaret might be assembling something far more sophisticated than a support network. The quiet secretary they'd underestimated was methodically preparing for a battle they couldn't imagine she was capable of fighting. The divorce papers arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered by courier while David was at the restaurant. Margaret read through the terms carefully, noting every assumption about her capabilities and contributions. The document painted her as a helpless dependent, someone incapable of understanding her own financial situation. She folded the papers neatly and placed them in a file folder marked with meticulous organization. Soon, very soon, David and his expensive lawyer would discover just how wrong their assumptions had been. The game was about to change completely. The family courthouse on Elm Street stood like a monument to justice, its marble columns and brass fixtures speaking of dignity and fairness. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early, her sensible navy suit and minimal jewelry presenting the image of a modest woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. She carried a single manila folder and sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, observing the theater about to unfold. David entered with the confidence of a man who owned the room. His legal team followed behind him like an expensive parade. Richard Morrison commanded attention in his charcoal Armani suit, flanked by two junior associates whose billable hours alone exceeded most annual salaries. They wheeled in boxes of documents, expensive leather briefcases, and the kind of technological equipment that signaled serious money at work. The Honorable Judge Elena Rodriguez took the bench with the measured authority of someone who had presided over countless divorce proceedings. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for theatrics and deception. She reviewed the preliminary documents while the courtroom settled into formal silence. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Rodriguez said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "please present your client's position for the court." Richard Morrison rose with practiced elegance, his opening statement delivered with the polish of decades spent dismantling marriages for wealthy clients. "Your Honor, this case presents a straightforward dissolution of marriage between a successful businessman and his dependent spouse. My client, David Lawson, has built a thriving restaurant empire through his vision, leadership, and business acumen over the past 15 years. He gestured toward David, who nodded with appropriate humility while maintaining an air of wounded dignity. Mr. Lawson has worked tirelessly to provide a comfortable lifestyle for his wife, who has chosen to pursue employment as a secretary at a local law firm. While we respect Mrs. Lawson's choice to work in a supporting role, the financial contributions to this marriage have been entirely one-sided." Margaret watched from her seat as Richard painted her as a woman content with simple work, someone who had never aspired to anything beyond typing letters and answering phones. His words carried the subtle condescension of a man explaining why the help shouldn't expect equal treatment. "Mrs. Lawson has enjoyed the benefits of her husband's success without contributing to its creation," Richard continued. "She has lived in a home she could never afford, traveled to destinations beyond her means, and enjoyed a social status entirely dependent on her husband's achievements. The evidence will show that her secretarial position, while admirable, generates minimal income and requires no specialized education or skills." David took the witness stand with the confidence of someone testifying about facts as obvious as gravity. Under Richard's careful questioning, he painted a picture of himself as the sole architect of their wealth and success. "Mr. Lawson, please describe your wife's role in your business operations," Richard prompted. David's voice carried just the right note of patient explanation. "Margaret has never been involved in any business decisions. She doesn't understand finance or restaurant management. Her job as a secretary keeps her busy, but it's really just basic office work. Filing, typing, that sort of thing." Judge Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "And how would you characterize her understanding of your financial affairs?" David's smile was condescending. "Your Honor, Margaret tries to help with household budgets, but complex financial planning is beyond her education level. I handle all the investment decisions, tax planning, and business strategy. She's more comfortable with simple tasks." Richard nodded approvingly. "Your Honor, we'll demonstrate that Mrs. Lawson's employment history consists entirely of entry-level administrative positions. She has no college degree, no professional certifications, and no experience managing significant financial responsibility. The court will see that Mr. Lawson's success stems from his own intelligence and hard work." The morning proceeded with methodical demolition of Margaret's perceived worth. David's accountant testified about the complexity of restaurant finance, emphasizing how such sophisticated operations required advanced business education. A business valuation expert explained market analysis techniques that he implied were far beyond a secretary's comprehension. Margaret sits alone at the plaintiff's table, her court-appointed attorneys seeming overwhelmed by the opposition's resources. James Fletcher was a competent family law practitioner, but his modest practice couldn't match the firepower of Richard Morrison's firm. He objected occasionally, but his efforts seemed perfunctory against such a well-orchestrated presentation. During the lunch recess, David held court in the hallway. His supporters gathered around him like courtiers attending a king. His restaurant managers expressed sympathy for his situation, noting how difficult it must be to explain financial complexity to someone without business training. She's probably overwhelmed by all this legal talk, observed Patricia Mills, David's general manager. It's got to be intimidating when you're used to simple office work. Margaret overheard these conversations as she sat quietly on a bench, eating a sandwich from home while reviewing her single folder of documents. To casual observers, she appeared exactly as David's team had portrayed her, a simple woman out of her depth in sophisticated legal proceedings. The afternoon session continued David's narrative of financial dominance. He described his strategic vision for restaurant expansion, his intuitive understanding of market trends, and his natural talent for investment analysis. Each answer reinforced the image of a brilliant businessman married to a woman whose contributions were limited to domestic support. Your Honor, David testified, I've always encouraged Margaret to pursue whatever interests her. The secretary position seemed perfect for her skill level. She enjoys the routine work, and it gives her something to do during the day. But when it comes to real financial decisions or business planning, she's always deferred to my expertise. Judge Rodriguez made careful notes, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of the testimony. She asked pointed questions about asset acquisition, business growth timelines, and investment strategies. David answered with obvious pride, describing his success as the natural result of superior intelligence and business instincts. Richard Morrison's presentation painted a compelling picture. David was the classic entrepreneur who had built wealth through vision and determination. Margaret was the supportive wife who had chosen a simple career appropriate to her limited capabilities. The financial disparity between them seemed as natural and inevitable as the law of gravity. As the court day concluded, David's confidence had reached triumphant levels. He spoke quietly with Richard about settlement negotiations, discussing how generous they might be in offering Margaret slightly more than the legal minimum. She'll probably be grateful for whatever we offer, David murmured. This has to be terrifying for someone who's never dealt with anything more complicated than office filing systems. Margaret gathered her single folder and left the courthouse without speaking to reporters or supporters. Her modest car contrasted sharply with David's luxury sedan, further emphasizing the economic disparity that seemed to define their marriage. But as she drove home through the evening traffic, Margaret's reflection in the rearview mirror showed something her husband had never bothered to notice. Behind the carefully maintained exterior of an overwhelmed secretary, her eyes held the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. The real show was about to begin. The second day of proceedings began with a subtle shift in atmosphere that only the most observant would notice. Margaret entered the courtroom wearing the same modest navy suit, but something had changed in her posture. She walked with measured confidence to the defendant's table, placing her manila folder with precise care before taking her seat. James Fletcher, her attorney, had undergone his own transformation overnight. The overwhelmed demeanor of the previous day had been replaced by focused intensity. He arranged documents on his table with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle, occasionally glancing at Margaret with what appeared to be newfound respect. Your Honor, Mr. Fletcher began when court reconvened. The defense would like to present evidence regarding Mrs. Lawson's professional qualifications and contributions to the marriage. We believe the court will find these materials quite illuminating. David shifted in his seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. Richard Morrison maintained his confident expression, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Fletcher approach the bench with a thick folder of documents. Judge Rodriguez accepted the folder and began reviewing its contents. Her eyebrows rose incrementally as she turned each page, her judicial composure masking what appeared to be growing surprise. The silence stretched across the courtroom like a taut wire, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the distant hum of courthouse air conditioning. Mr. Fletcher, Judge Rodriguez said finally, are these documents properly authenticated? Yes, Your Honor. We have certified copies of all educational transcripts, professional licensing documentation, and continuing education certificates. Each document includes official seals and verification numbers that can be independently confirmed. David's confident smile began to waver as he watched the judge's careful examination of whatever evidence Margaret's attorney had presented. He leaned toward Richard Morrison, whispering urgently about the unexpected development. Please proceed with your presentation, Mr. Fletcher, Judge Rodriguez instructed. Fletcher returned to his position, his voice carrying new authority as he addressed the courtroom. Your Honor, yesterday's testimony painted Mrs. Lawson as a simple secretary with limited education and no significant professional qualifications. The evidence before you tells a dramatically different story. Margaret remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but something in her eyes had sharpened to laser focus. Mrs. Lawson graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a Bachelor of Science in Accounting, Fletcher continued. She subsequently earned her Master of Business Administration from the Kellogg School of Management, specializing in corporate finance and tax strategy. David's face went pale. He stared at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time, his mouth slightly open in bewildered shock. Richard Morrison's confident expression cracked, revealing the first hint of concern as he processed the implications of this revelation. Furthermore, Fletcher said, producing additional documentation, Mrs. Lawson has maintained her certified public accountant license for the past 18 years. Her continuing education record shows advanced certifications in tax law, forensic accounting, and financial analysis. She has completed over 2,000 hours of professional development in complex financial planning and corporate restructuring. The courtroom felt charged with electric tension as the magnitude of David's misjudgment became apparent. Judge Rodriguez studied the documents with increasing attention, occasionally glancing at Margaret with evident curiosity. Your Honor, Fletcher continued, Mrs. Lawson's employment as a secretary at Hartwell and Associates was not due to limited qualifications. She chose that position specifically to provide sophisticated financial analysis and tax planning services while maintaining flexibility for other professional commitments. Margaret's composed exterior began showing traces of the formidable professional intelligence that David had somehow failed to notice for 15 years. When Fletcher asked her to take the witness stand, she rose with quiet dignity and walked forward with the measured confidence of someone entirely comfortable in formal legal proceedings. Mrs. Lawson, Fletcher began, please describe your educational background for the court. Margaret's voice was clear and professionally modulated as she recounted her academic achievements. I graduated from Northwestern University in 1995 with highest honors, maintaining a 3.97 GPA while completing advanced coursework in corporate accounting, taxation, and financial analysis. I was inducted into Beta Alpha Psi, the National Accounting Honor Society, and received the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence. David gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. This was not the woman he thought he had married, not the simple secretary who had smiled quietly while he dismissed her intelligence for over a decade. I completed my MBA at Kellogg in 1998, Margaret continued, focusing on corporate finance and strategic tax planning. My thesis examined optimization strategies for multi-entity business structures, with particular emphasis on restaurant and hospitality industry applications. The irony of that last detail struck the courtroom like lightning. Margaret had specialized in exactly the type of financial analysis that David's business empire required, yet he had spent years explaining basic concepts to her, as if she were intellectually incapable of understanding them. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward with obvious interest. Mrs. Lawson, how long have you maintained your CPA certification? Since 1999, Your Honor. I complete 40 hours of continuing education annually, focusing on advanced tax code changes, forensic accounting techniques, and complex financial planning strategies. My license is current and in good standing with the State Board of Accountancy. Richard Morrison finally found his voice, objecting to the relevance of educational credentials that had supposedly never been applied to the marriage's financial affairs. His objection carried a note of desperation that had been entirely absent from his earlier confident presentations. Your Honor, Fletcher responded smoothly. Mrs. Lawson's professional qualifications are directly relevant to her contributions to the marriage. The court will see that her expertise has been instrumental in building and maintaining the very wealth that Mr. Lawson claims as his sole creation. Judge Rodriguez overruled the objection and instructed Fletcher to continue. The momentum had shifted dramatically, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the change like pressure before a storm. Mrs. Lawson, Fletcher said, please describe your role in your husband's business operations. Margaret's answer came with the precision of someone who had been waiting years to tell this story. I have provided comprehensive financial analysis, tax optimization, and strategic planning for all 3 restaurant locations since their inception. This included entity structure design, depreciation scheduling, cash flow analysis, and regulatory compliance management. David's face cycled through emotions like a broken traffic light. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into growing horror as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. The court would like to examine these professional credentials more closely, Judge Rodriguez announced. Court will recess for 30 minutes while I review the documentation in detail. As the courtroom emptied for recess, David sat frozen in his chair, staring at Margaret with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. The woman he had patronized and diminished for 15 years was revealing herself to be far more qualified than he had ever imagined possible. Richard Morrison huddled with his client, their urgent whispers carrying notes of panic as they tried to adjust their strategy to accommodate this seismic shift in the case's foundation. Margaret remained calm and composed, discussing procedural matters with her attorney while David's supporters began exchanging worried glances. The confident predictions of easy victory were evaporating like morning mist under harsh sunlight. The game had changed completely, and everyone knew it. When court reconvened, Judge Rodriguez had clearly spent the recess conducting her own research. Her demeanor had shifted from judicial curiosity to focused intensity, and she regarded Margaret with the respect typically reserved for expert witnesses in complex financial cases. Mr. Fletcher, the court is prepared to hear additional evidence regarding Mrs. Lawson's professional contributions. Please proceed. Fletcher approached the evidence table with renewed confidence, lifting a comprehensive portfolio that dwarfed the simple manila folder Margaret had carried the previous day. Your Honor, we would like to present Mrs. Lawson's complete professional work product as it relates to the Lawson Business Enterprises. The first exhibit sent shockwaves through David's confident facade. Fletcher displayed detailed financial analyses spanning the past 15 years, each document bearing Margaret's professional seal and signature. The papers revealed sophisticated tax optimization strategies that had saved David's restaurants hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. This is Mrs. Lawson's comprehensive restructuring plan for the Lawson Restaurant Group, implemented in 2015, Fletcher explained. The strategy reduced tax liability by 43% while establishing depreciation schedules that maximized cash flow for expansion purposes. Margaret took the witness stand again, but this time her transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the diminished secretary persona. She spoke with the authority of someone presenting to corporate boards, her voice carrying the confident precision of a financial expert. Mrs. Lawson, Fletcher began, please describe your role in establishing the initial business structure for your husband's restaurants. Margaret's response revealed the depth of David's self-deception. I designed the complete entity framework in 2008, including the LLC structures, partnership agreements, and tax election strategies. The initial business plan, market analysis, and financial projections were my work product, prepared using industry-standard modeling techniques. David's face had progressed from pale to ashen. He leaned heavily on the plaintiff's table, his expensive suit suddenly appearing to hang on him like borrowed clothes. The confidence that had carried him through yesterday's testimony had been replaced by growing desperation. Richard Morrison attempted damage control, objecting to the relevance of historical business planning to current asset division. His objections lacked their previous authority, carrying instead the desperate tone of an attorney watching his case collapse in real time. Your Honor, Fletcher continued, Mrs. Lawson has maintained detailed records of her professional services to the Lawson businesses. These records demonstrate consistent, sophisticated financial management that directly created the wealth Mr. Lawson now claims as his independent achievement. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and precision. Margaret had documented every financial strategy, every tax optimization, every investment analysis that had guided David's business decisions. What he had attributed to his natural business instincts was revealed as the product of Margaret's professional expertise, carefully implemented and quietly managed. Mrs. Lawson, Judge Rodriguez interjected, can you explain how your professional services were compensated during the marriage? Margaret's answer cut through David's claims of sole financial contribution with surgical precision. Your Honor, I provided these services without separate compensation as part of my contribution to our joint financial success. The value of professional financial planning and tax strategy services of this scope would typically range from $60,000 to $80,000 annually. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as the implications became clear. Margaret had been providing high-level professional services worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, while David dismissed her as someone who merely typed letters. Fletcher then presented Margaret's client testimonials, collected quietly during the weeks leading up to trial. The first witness was Dr. Patricia Vance, the cardiac surgeon from the charity gala who had questioned Margaret about her work. Dr. Vance took the stand with professional authority, her medical credentials lending weight to her financial testimony. I consulted Mrs. Lawson regarding my practice's corporate structure and tax planning strategies. Her analysis identified optimization opportunities that saved my practice over $200,000 in the first year alone. David stared at Dr. Vance in disbelief. The woman he had dismissed as someone impressed by his secretary wife was actually Margaret's professional client, someone who had paid substantial fees for the same expertise David had been receiving for free. The parade of witnesses continued, each one dismantling another piece of David's constructed reality. A prominent real estate developer testified about Margaret's analysis of commercial property investments. A technology startup founder described her comprehensive tax strategy consultation. Each witness spoke of Margaret with the respect reserved for top-tier financial professionals. Mrs. Lawson's work is extraordinarily sophisticated, testified Marcus Chin, managing partner of a major investment firm. Her understanding of complex tax code applications and regulatory compliance issues rivals that of the most experienced professionals in our industry. We've retained her services multiple times for high-stakes financial restructuring projects. Richard Morrison's cross-examination attempts grew increasingly desperate as each witness confirmed Margaret's professional reputation and expertise. His questions revealed his own growing awareness that David had been living a complete delusion about his wife's capabilities. Dr. Vance, is it your professional opinion that Mrs. Lawson possesses advanced financial planning expertise? Dr. Vance's response was unequivocal. Absolutely. Her analysis was more thorough and innovative than work I've received from major accounting firms. She identified strategies that other professionals had missed entirely. Judge Rodriguez made extensive notes throughout each testimony, her expression growing more serious as the scope of David's deception became apparent. The man who had portrayed himself as the sole architect of their wealth was being revealed as someone who had unknowingly been the beneficiary of his wife's hidden professional services. Fletcher then presented the most damaging evidence yet. Your Honor, Mrs. Lawson maintained detailed time records of her professional services to the Lawson businesses. These records show over 1,500 billable hours annually, work that would command premium rates in the professional marketplace. Margaret's testimony became increasingly technical as she described complex financial instruments, regulatory compliance strategies, and market analysis techniques that had guided every major business decision David thought he had made independently. The depreciation recapture strategy one implemented in 2019 generated additional cash flow of $68,000, Margaret explained with quiet authority. The entity restructuring completed that same year optimized tax positioning for the planned expansion while maintaining operational flexibility for future growth opportunities. David's attempts to whisper urgent instructions to Richard Morrison became more frantic as each revelation destroyed another pillar of his case. The successful businessman facade was crumbling to reveal someone who had been unknowingly dependent on his wife's expertise while simultaneously dismissing her intelligence. Judge Rodriguez finally called a recess, her expression grave as she considered the magnitude of deception that had been exposed. David sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, staring at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time in 15 years of marriage. The woman he had introduced as his secretary wife, someone who just typed letters and made coffee, had been quietly orchestrating the financial strategies that built his entire business empire. Every success he had attributed to his own brilliance was revealed as the product of Margaret's professional expertise, freely given and casually dismissed. The complete truth was finally emerging, and David's world was collapsing around him. Judge Rodriguez returned to the bench after the longest recess of the proceedings, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed a profound deception unravel in her courtroom. The silence was absolute as she arranged her notes and prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a decisive ruling. This court has rarely encountered such a systematic misrepresentation of the facts, Judge Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the authority of absolute moral clarity. The evidence presented reveals a marriage where one spouse provided sophisticated professional services valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, while the other spouse not only failed to acknowledge these contributions, but actively diminished the contributor's worth and intelligence. David's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly gray color. His expensive suit seemed to hang on him like a costume from a play he no longer understood. Richard Morrison sat frozen beside him, his legal expertise rendered useless by the complete collapse of their case's foundation. Mr. Lawson, Judge Rodriguez continued, you presented yourself to this court as the sole architect of your business success. You characterized your wife as a simple secretary whose contributions were limited to basic domestic support. The evidence demonstrates that this characterization was not merely inaccurate, but represented a complete inversion of reality. Margaret sat perfectly still, but something fundamental had shifted in her presence. The diminished secretary persona had been completely shed, replaced by someone who radiated quiet professional authority. Her transformation was visible to everyone in the courtroom, a revelation of the competent executive who had been hidden beneath years of careful deception. The financial records, expert testimony, and professional documentation prove that Mrs. Lawson provided comprehensive financial planning, tax optimization, and strategic business guidance that created and sustained the wealth you now claim as your independent achievement, the judge stated. Her work product demonstrates sophistication and expertise that would command premium fees in the professional marketplace. Judge Rodriguez lifted Margaret's portfolio of work, its thickness a stark contrast to David's increasingly desperate appearance. This court finds that Mrs. Lawson's professional contributions to the marriage were not only substantial, but foundational. The business success attributed to Mr. Lawson's acumen was largely the product of his wife's specialized knowledge and strategic planning. David's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The confident businessman who had entered the courthouse expecting easy victory was confronting the reality that his entire self-image had been built on a foundation of willful ignorance about his wife's capabilities. Furthermore, Judge Rodriguez continued, the court notes with concern Mr. Lawson's systematic diminishment of his wife's intelligence and professional worth. The testimony reveals years of public humiliation designed to maintain Mrs. Lawson's professional contributions as hidden assets while dismissing her value as a human being. The judge's moral indignation was controlled but unmistakable. This behavior represents not merely financial deception, but a fundamental betrayal of the partnership that marriage is intended to represent. Richard Morrison made one final desperate attempt at damage control, requesting consideration of David's position as the apparent income earner. Judge Rodriguez's response was swift and devastating. Mr. Morrison, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Lawson's income was entirely dependent on professional services provided without compensation by his wife. This court cannot reward such exploitation with favorable asset division. The ruling that followed was comprehensive and devastating to David's expectations. Judge Rodriguez awarded Margaret 75% of all marital assets, including controlling interest in all 3 restaurants. The decision recognized her professional contributions as the primary driver of their accumulated wealth. Mrs. Lawson will retain the family residence, the investment portfolio, and majority ownership of the restaurant business that her financial expertise created and sustained, Judge Rodriguez announced. Mr. Lawson will receive 25% of liquid assets and may retain minority interest in the business operations, subject to Mrs. Lawson's management oversight. David's face registered pure shock as the magnitude of his defeat became clear. The woman he had dismissed as intellectually inferior had not only revealed herself as more qualified than him, but had legally established her right to control the empire he thought he owned. Additionally, Judge Rodriguez continued, this court awards Mrs. Lawson compensation for professional services provided during the marriage. The value of her financial planning and strategic guidance, calculated at standard professional rates, totals approximately $800,000 over the 15-year period. The courtroom erupted in quiet conversations as observers processed the complete reversal of expected outcomes. David's supporters, who had anticipated celebrating his victory over a helpless secretary, instead witnessed his total humiliation at the hands of the woman they had all underestimated. Margaret rose to address the court, and her transformation was complete. She spoke with the authority of someone who had finally stepped into her true professional identity after years of hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. Your Honor, thank you for recognizing the reality of my contributions to this marriage. I look forward to managing these business assets with the same expertise I have always applied, but now with appropriate recognition and authority. Her voice carried no triumph, no vindictiveness, only the quiet confidence of someone whose professional competence had been vindicated by objective examination. David stared at her as if seeing a stranger, finally understanding that he had been married to someone whose intellectual capabilities far exceeded his own. As the court session concluded, the news of David's spectacular defeat spread through their social circle with the velocity of scandal. The charity gala crowd that had witnessed his condescending treatment of Margaret now learned that the dismissed secretary wife had been the financial mastermind behind his success. Dr. Patricia Vance called her colleagues to share the remarkable story. The woman David introduced as someone who just typed letters was actually the CPA who had optimized her medical practice's financial structure. The irony was delicious, and the social consequences for David were immediate and severe. His restaurant managers received the news with varying degrees of shock and concern. The man they had respected as a visionary leader was revealed as someone who had unknowingly been implementing his wife's professional strategies while taking credit for her expertise. Patricia Mills, his general manager, found herself reevaluating every business meeting where David had presented complex financial analyses. She now understood that the sophisticated planning she had attributed to his business acumen had actually been Margaret's professional work, quietly prepared and humbly submitted without recognition. The transformation in Margaret's professional life was swift and dramatic. Word of her courtroom vindication spread through the financial planning community, generating immediate demand for her services. Clients who had been impressed by her previous work began offering her high-profile consulting opportunities. Within 6 months, Margaret had established her own financial planning firm, specializing in complex business restructuring and tax optimization. Her client list grew rapidly as word spread about the CPA whose expertise had been hidden behind a secretary's modest facade. The office she chose overlooked the city's business district, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a view of the courthouse where her professional competence had finally been recognized. She hired a small staff of qualified professionals and began building the practice she had always been capable of managing. David's circumstances declined as precipitously as Margaret's rose. The minority stake in his former restaurants provided minimal income, while his attempts to secure new financing met with skeptical questions about his actual business qualifications. Lenders who reviewed the court records questioned whether he possessed the expertise to manage complex business operations without his ex-wife's guidance. His social standing evaporated as the truth about Margaret's contributions became common knowledge. Former associates who had enjoyed his confident dismissal of his secretary wife now wondered what other aspects of his success had been borrowed or stolen. Invitations to exclusive events dried up as his reputation shifted from successful entrepreneur to exposed fraud. Margaret's story became legend in professional circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating someone based on their job title or modest presentation. She spoke occasionally at women's professional organizations, sharing her experience as an example of how competence could be hidden but never truly suppressed. The restaurants continued operating under Margaret's strategic guidance, their profitability increasing as her expertise was applied openly rather than through David's inadequate interpretation. The staff who had once pitted her as the dismissed secretary wife now recognized her as the financial architect who had built their successful workplace. Years later, Margaret reflected on the irony of her situation while reviewing quarterly reports in her executive office. The man who had spent 15 years explaining basic concepts to her had been unknowingly dependent on her advanced expertise. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality that his supposedly simple wife possessed qualifications that surpassed his own. The secretary persona had been a role she played to maintain peace in a marriage built on David's delusions of superiority. When forced to reveal her true capabilities, she had demonstrated that intelligence and competence could not be permanently hidden by modest clothing and quiet demeanor. Justice had been served not through revenge or vindictiveness, but through the simple revelation of truth. The court had recognized reality over perception, substance over presentation, and competence over arrogance. David learned, far too late, that dismissing someone's intelligence said more about the dismisser than the dismissed. Margaret had always been exactly who she was. He had simply been too blind to see her clearly. The game was finally over, and the real winner had been evident all along.